Prejudice. What is prejudice exactly? The word looks like pre, meaning before, and Judas looks kind of like judicial, which reminds you of judging. That is the literal etymology, but pre-judging? Pre what? What are we judging before? Before meeting a person? I believe the answer is prejudice is the general before the specific. In that sense, prejudice is neutral. It can be right or wrong. Your prejudice can turn out to be true, it can turn out to be false, the same way that your knowledge can be correct or mistaken, or your habits can be good or bad. Prejudice is a form of social knowledge. I walk outside my house. I see a bear. How do I react? I can't know for sure if this bear is a threat to me. It's possible it's a well-trained performance animal, and yet I know that bears are generally dangerous, ergo I react with caution. This is prejudice. I have a prejudice of bears, which is that I know them to be dangerous, generally. And in this instance, I was well served by that prejudice. A person without any prejudice, if you can imagine such a thing, would be utterly incapable of navigating the world. A baby, essentially. They wouldn't know who their friends are, they wouldn't know what's a threat to them, they wouldn't be able to figure out any unfamiliar problem or interpret any unfamiliar situations. They wouldn't make any connections in their mind, they wouldn't recognize patterns or extrapolate based on their past experiences. A mistaken prejudice is one that is misaligned with reality. This can be a matter of exaggeration, meaning a mistake of scale or amplitude. It can be a misunderstanding of the relation between facts, or it can just be sheer dumb error. Somebody who once heard something that turns out to not be true. For example, I once heard it said that gay men shouldn't be allowed to be school teachers because most child molesters are gay men. I don't know if that's actually true, I suspect it isn't. Or rather, we would probably have to have an uncomfortable conversation about the very nature of sexuality or what it means to be a gay man, because I think they were just assuming that if you're a man and then you molest a boy, that makes you a gay man, and I understand why they would think that, but I don't actually think that's true. But I didn't even get into any of that. Instead, I just asked, but how many gay men are child molesters? It could be that almost all child molesters are gay, but that almost all gay people are non-child molesters. That most molestation is done by gay men, but the vast, vast majority of gay men don't do any such abuse. Perhaps the difference in amplitude you're describing amounts to 0.03% of the general population, and then 0.45 for gay men. That's 15 times higher, which when you say it like that sounds like a big difference. But it's still less than 1 in 200 people. Are we going to fire the 199 because the one might be a criminal? There are similar observations we can make about other group associations that are all similarly on the edge of being very offensive, but we can take for the sake of discussion anyhow. Even if all terrorism, for example, were done by Muslims, which I don't think is true, and we would have to get into what it really means for something to be terrorism and blah blah blah, but the point is that even if that were the case, it would still be the case that the vast majority of Muslims never engage in terrorism. So there's like a mistake being made about the relation between these two things. All terrorists being Muslims doesn't really justify having a prejudice against Muslims because very, very, very few Muslims are terrorists, really. So sometimes your prejudice about a group is miscalibrated, and you may end up reacting to a person as though they present a danger of some kind, when in reality they very likely do not. As the US President George W. Bush once said, too often we judge other groups by their worst examples while judging ourselves by our best intentions. Yeah, no, he really said that. George Bush. Yeah. If you have a perception about some general trend, but encounter an outlier, something that doesn't fit your expectations, then the specific ought to triumph over the general. That's how a rational person behaves. Let's say you're in a city where there are many Chinese immigrants, and most of them have very bad English. You might, when speaking to a Chinese guy at the store whom you're meeting for the very first time, address him more slowly and clearly, as one normally does when speaking to somebody whose English skills are very poor. You're trying to make sure that they can understand you. But if he turns around and replies in perfect English, and you realize, oh, this is like a Chinese background person, but he was clearly raised in the country and he speaks English just as well as anybody else, you wouldn't carry on speaking slowly to him, right? You would instantly switch over and start speaking to him the same way that you would to anybody else. The specific triumphs over the general. I think where prejudice becomes a problem is when you see instead an inversion of the general and specific, where you treat the outlier as though it is the trend. That is, we know this person is not merely the average impression of their group, and yet we continue to act as though they are. This often occurs where a certain prejudice is being held with contempt. Or, in a way that is less directly hateful, it happens when the nonconformity of a person of a certain group to the average of that group causes us any kind of discomfort. Namely, when their excellence, as in them literally excelling in some way, threatens a feeling of superiority that we've grown accustomed to. For a more benign example of this, think about how you might feel if a young child came along and did better than you at something. Adults are pretty well accustomed to feeling better than children at pretty much everything, so feeling like you've been outdone by a young child can be pretty embarrassing and make you feel kinda dumb. It's like it's disrupting the adult-child status quo in a way that you don't like. But there are other forms of this disruption that can be less justified. It is fair and accurate, for example, to expect that women know less about car mechanics than men do. That is just going to be true most of the time. But even if a woman walks into your garage and says a few things that indicate she knows what she's talking about, maybe you have the hood up on your car and she looks over and she can tell what's wrong, and maybe you two chat for a while and she says, yeah, she works as a mechanic. There will still be some men who continue talking down to her about the topic, talking as though she doesn't really know what she's talking about, or that she can't really know as much about this topic as it seems. First, because they're so accustomed to feeling that women know less about this topic than they do, and second, because the idea that a woman might know more about it than them, it makes them feel inferior by comparison. They're used to knowing more. They don't want to know less. Feels bad. A similar thing then happens with race and ethnicity. If a person is used to thinking that most black people they encounter are less educated than they are and talking down to them, they might feel like that's justified because, hey, look, it's true on average. But they also might refuse to adjust their tone even if they meet a really well-educated black guy someday. They might still just talk down to him anyway, and on some level it might be because they resent the idea of a black man being more educated than they are, of a black man exceeding their prejudice about black people. I see this a lot in the way that people react to Ilhan Omar, a woman from Somalia. There is a perception about Somalis as being people who fled to America from the chaos of Somalia, many of them poor farmers with little education, many of them still holding on to what we consider more vulgar cultural values, less civilized, high emphasis on what clan you're a part of, don't like gay rights, don't like women's rights, don't like modern governments, and they want to treat Ilhan Omar as though she is an instance of this impression that they have about the group that she comes from. And they resent the fact that, to the contrary, she's an intelligent, well-educated person who believes in tolerance and in American values to a greater degree than her vulgar critics typically do. They want to look down on her. They want to speak down to her, as though she is only what their prejudice anticipates. They resent that she has risen above those expectations. They resent that her specific excellence in this respect threatens their generalized feelings of superiority over the group that she came from. They don't want to have to look up to a Somali because they feel that Somalis are supposed to be below them. I believe that Black Americans have been subject to a similar dynamic for a long time. The white American experience was that you don't really interact with that many black people. Most people in your town and most people who you ever talk to or spend time with are white, but the impression that you get is that black people are less wealthy, less educated, more likely to engage in petty criminality, and all of that causes white people to look down on them and have a general aversion to them. But then many white people will persist in treating a black person as their lesser, even if they encounter one who doesn't have these stereotypical qualities. If they encounter a black person who's wealthy, intelligent, and law-abiding, who breaks from that pattern of their experience, they would just still spit on him and treat him like he's lesser anyway. And the feeling that you will be looked down on, even if you personally excel, even if you rise above your circumstances, is surely rather disheartening. To know that even if you succeed in life, it won't be properly acknowledged and rewarded. This is the tyranny of the general. It's a consequence not merely of prejudice, but of a race-based animosity, of a mindset or culture of superiority that is sensitive to challenge, and of all the bias of judgment that comes from as irrational a place as hatred or the playing out of a defense mechanism of one's ego. If a man is lazy, then he is lazy. If a black man is lazy, it goes to show that black people are lazy. If a guy is bad at math, then he is bad at math. But if a woman is bad at math, it goes to show that women are bad at math. What's happening here? We have a tendency to map negative observations about a person onto how we feel about any given identity of theirs that isn't dominant, the majority, or otherwise the presumed default. This means we make connections between things that may coincide in practice, but which may also deviate, or which might not even have a causal relation. In the past, the rich looked down on the poor. They said the poor were dirty, uneducated, rude, they were thieves, they were lazy, and so on. They had all of these negative qualities. Then some poor immigrants came to the city, and all of those complaints were repeated, but this time transposed onto the race of the immigrants. Instead of saying the poor are such and such, now it's the Mexicans are such and such, seemingly without it occurring to anyone how irrelevant being Mexican was to the rest. We're now just describing the Mexicans, or whatever immigrant group it is, the same way that we used to describe the poor people of our own group. Today, what is expressed as, or takes the form of, animosity toward a certain group of people is generally rooted really in a grievance about something else. So when people are being racist or otherwise hateful about something, it can be worth trying to figure out what that something else is so that we could talk about it instead of the race of the people doing it. I once knew somebody who had a Persian landlord, and this landlord sometimes did stuff he didn't like, so he would react by cursing about, "Oh God, yeah, I have this Persian landlord." But what did him being Persian have to do with anything? Would the situation have been better in some way if he wasn't Persian? Do we think that Persians are more likely to be bad landlords? Like, is there something about him being Persian? Like, what's the connection? I talked to him about it, and the answer was basically no, there is no relation. He just happens to be a Persian guy. Okay, well, if he just happens to be a Persian guy and him being Persian isn't the problem, then why do you keep bringing it up? But once something becomes a stereotypical quality of a certain group, due to us making this type of connection repeatedly, then we sort of become programmed to look for further examples of it. If we think that Asian people are bad drivers, then we're more likely to notice when we think Asian people are bad at driving, and then take that as confirmation of the feelings that we already had. This is related to the perception of outgroup homogeneity. The better we know a category of people, the more we're able to perceive the diversity or difference within that category. Hey, I said something like this already in my India video. And of course, we naturally know ourselves and our group better than we know others. Thus, we see ourselves as more diverse, and we see other groups as more homogeneous because we don't know as much about what's inside the category. This has been neatly encapsulated in the phrase, "They are alike, we are diverse." So if a member of our group has a flaw, we understand that this doesn't reflect on all of us. We are diverse. Sure, some of us may have some flaws, but others don't. Some of us might be bad drivers, but others are good drivers. Whereas if a member of some other group has a flaw, we're more likely to see that flaw as a reflection of the whole group, because they are alike. Or rather, we have a sort of bias that makes it feel as though they are alike. So this one person's flaws reflects on all of them, because they're all kind of the same. This difference in perception seems to be a consequence of the difference in background data. When I conceptualize my own group, creating a model of us in my mind, I'm drawing from my experiences of many thousands and thousands of people. If I then try to conceptualize some other group that I have less experience with, Jewish people, let's say, well, that number is now far smaller, a handful at most. We do supplement our experiences with media portrayals, but media portrayals then tend often to be averages and stereotypes that flatten away the internal diversity of groups of people that are not the norm, the same way that we do to ourselves psychologically. So unfortunately, our media often further serves the exact same bias. We may understand intellectually, when given the thought for consideration, that of course other groups of people must have internal diversity rivaling our own, but we haven't experienced it, So there's a pre-rational part of our mind that doesn't feel that diversity in the same way. We know it's there, but if you're not being thoughtful, or if you never really stop and think about these things, your behavior may still default to that of somebody who believes they are alike, we are diverse. When we talk about prejudice, generalization, or stereotype, we're often referring to the social treatment of outgroups, which usually refers to a minority group. The main exception to this is women. Much of what's been said or written about social treatment of minority groups is also applicable to society's treatment of women, despite women in many countries outnumbering men, but certainly on average being about at parity. They are not a minority. So if being a minority isn't the thing that causes this difference in treatment, then, well, what is? A better descriptor of the sort of group we're talking about would be those who aren't the default or the norm. If I say a person walks into your place of business, but I provide no information about that person other than that they walk into your place of business, well, what do you imagine? Unless otherwise specified, a typical listener would assume that this is a white person. Not that it matters, that's just the first thing that comes to mind. It's a function of white people being the majority in our country. If you put the names of every single person in our country into a hat and then picked a name at random, the most likely result is that you're going to draw the name of a white person. If I wanted you to think that this person was Chinese, then I would need to specify that. This can be heard in how normal people talk, even where the distinctions are unimportant. I've heard people say things like, I was at the library earlier, and there weren't many people there. There was just this one guy at the table reading, and then there was this black dude using the printers. I heard the city is expanding the budget this year. Why did they say it was a black guy? And what race do you suppose that makes the person at the table? If you're not listening for it, it might breeze by you unnoticed, because it doesn't even really sound out of place. It's just how people talk. It's not necessarily harmful, it's just a reflection of what's happening in our mind. We specify things that are not the default. And women are not the default, despite often being the majority of people. If you say a person walks into a building, it's just presumed that you're talking about a man. And he is used more often than she when we're talking about an abstract or generic person, such as if any student leaves his car in the parking lot, he will have to pay a fine. When we're not referring to anybody in particular, we just default to saying he. Now, okay, this is changing. There has been an effort in recent years to use more gender-neutral phrasing, or in some cases people will default to using female pronouns just because they want to push in the other direction. But for hundreds of years, people just defaulted to male for everything unless they were specifically talking about something for women. That's probably going to take a while to disappear from our collective psyche. This is all a byproduct of men having more voice, agency, or I guess we could just say power, than women historically. The vast majority of people who ever had any kind of political authority were men. Only men could be leaders in the church. Throughout society, men controlled pretty much all the money, they had all the power within the households, and they were more likely to be the ones who wrote down pretty much anything important. The vast majority of stuff ever written was written by men from a man's perspective. So even in cases where women outnumbered them, men were still the default, the norm, the main people who went out and did stuff and made decisions and had things said about them. So our whole society, men and women, all became accustomed to it being the case that unless you specify otherwise, you're probably talking about a man. If we're talking about an area of society that is strongly associated with a certain group, the presumed default can change. If I said I was at yoga class earlier and one of the other people there had a really nice water bottle, you might have thought of a woman even though I didn't actually specify because that's what you associate with yoga class. And when the presumed default identity changes, you can see an inversion of the usual mapping of personal qualities onto group identity. If a man is bad at math, he's bad at math. If a woman is bad at math, it goes to show that women are bad at math. But if a man is bad at vacuuming the house or some other household chore, that may go to show that men are bad at doing those things, and women may even suggest as much when they notice a man doing a bad job of it. So when it comes to more specific domains, it is possible for pretty much all of these dynamics to work in reverse. And we could repeat this about other jobs or other areas of society that are highly associated with a non-default type of person.